Hello and welcome to the next topic, approaches to equivalence and the science of translating. Now I'm going to start with a quote from translation theorist Anthony Pym, who has infamously said that equivalence is a very simple idea. Unfortunately, it becomes quite complex both as a term and as a theory. And I thought I'd begin with that because equivalence is probably the area that students struggle the most with in terms of the fact that it is quite a linguistically derived theory, which means that it also uses a lot of linguistic terminology, which some of you may or may not be comfortable with. The way that it's been applied has also been quite confusing in some areas, so hopefully today we'll be able to unpack some of those definitions, and of course we'll have time in the workshop to spend more time doing some practical applications of the theory as well. So if we look at the chronology, we're in the mid-50s to mid-80s now, and the key periods that we're looking at are the 1960s, where we have Eugene Nida, who's probably the most famous equivalence theorist, and his work on Bible translation. And he came up with the terms formal and dynamic equivalence, which you'll hear more about as we proceed. Then in the 1970s and early 80s in Germany, there were the schools of Übersetzungswissenschaft, which basically just refers to a science of translation. And the early 1980s, we had Newmark's work on semantic and communicative translation. So these were all linguistically oriented approaches to translation studies. So looking at translation studies as a branch of applied linguistics. So if you think about that diagram we looked at in the introductory lecture, we had various approaches to, or interdisciplinary approaches to translation studies, and of course applied linguistics sat on that diagram. This also presented an alternative to the slightly circular debate of the pre-20th century translation studies, which basically centered around this literal versus free discussion. So the attempt was, during this period, to arrive at a more systematic analysis of translation, to make the study, or at least attempt to make the study, more scientific, and to use views and methods of the sciences, especially maths and formal logic, in order to do this. So you'll notice that these theories do have a more scientific kind of application, and as I said, the influence very strongly comes from linguistics. The contemporary application of this theory rests with Anthony Pym and his recasting of equivalence with the terms natural and directional, and we'll be looking at those two terms as well. We're going back to our good friend Roman Jakobson, who of course we've already visited in our introductory lecture, and his categorization of intralingual, interlingual and intersemiotic translation. So what Jakobson did was he followed the theory of language proposed by French linguist Saussure, who distinguished between what he called the linguistic system, or the langue, and the individual utterances, which he called the parole. So within the langue, Saussure had established a relationship between what he calls the signifier, which is the spoken and written signal, and the signified, which is the concept being signified. So if we think of a really basic example here, we could say that table, the word table in English, T-A-B-L-E, is the spoken and written signal. And the signified then would be perhaps a wooden object with 4 legs. So together, the signifier, which is the written word table, and the signified, which is this concept of a wooden structure with 4 legs, form the linguistic sign. Now the problem, of course, is that the signifier is arbitrary. We could actually call this wooden object with 4 legs anything. We could call it gobbledygook, or we could call it television, or we could call it Leah. It doesn't really matter. And if we think of how we teach language to a child, of course, they entrust in us that we are teaching them, of course, the correct signifier for the signified. But in fact, as I said, this signifier is completely arbitrary. So therefore, the question is it possible to understand something signified that you've never actually seen or tasted or heard? So if you think of something that doesn't exist within your culture or your language system, is it still possible to imagine this? And Jakobson says, yes, it is certainly possible. The problem, of course, with equivalence, which arises in this process is when we have different concepts for certain things. So if we think of the word cheese, and this is the example given in this study, the word cheese, of course, varies significantly across cultures. And Jacobson uses the example of the Russian syr, which is not the same as the English cheese or even cheeses in other cultures. So the Russian cheese does not include, for example, a soft white cheese like a cottage cheese, which of course this English generic term cheese does include. So we can still understand or translate this, what we would call the full semantic meaning of the word cheese or the concept cheese, even if in Russian, for example, this means breaking it down into two separate concepts. So if we were to translate this into Russian, we would obviously need to use a different word to translate this notion of cheese that includes all kinds of different cheeses. Jacobson also mentions that cross-linguistic differences can exist around what he calls obligatory grammatical and lexical forms, and these are detailed quite clearly in Monday, and I'm not going to go into them in great detail. They're fairly obvious. So for example, at the level of gender, he takes the example of the word house, which is feminine in Romance languages. It's neuter in German and also English. At the level of aspect as well, and at the level of semantic fields. So if we're to achieve equivalence in interlingual translation, this means that the translator might need to make use of synonyms in order to get the full source text message across, but there might not be full equivalence between the actual code units. So the underlying assumption here is that we can provide equivalent concepts interlingually, but of course the code units might differ. So this concept of cheese, going back to that example, is certainly existing across different cultures, but we might need different code units to describe that. And Jacobson says only poetry, where form expresses sense, requires creative transposition and is in that way untranslatable. So I'd like you to do a little exercise to bring to the workshop where you think about the different concepts of cheese, bread, and also sausage in your languages and in your cultures. So could you think about how you might describe to someone who's never seen cheese, bread, or sausage, how they look and how they taste? And after you've done that, can you think about how you might find equivalence for those concepts in English? And then the final question is, how could you translate the full semantic meaning of these concepts into English? So make some notes and we'll be discussing this in your workshop.